Hello and welcome on this incredibly humid day in Ryde on the Isle of Wight. Kind of dripping already. Welcome to this David Icke videocast and podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, of course, the news in Britain has been dominated day after day by the referendum campaign to stay in or leave the EU. And having watched the tidal wave of lies and attempts to frighten the public into staying in the EU because of all the consequences of coming out, like freedom, it's amazing that the opinion polls currently are so close, with the Leave campaign in some polls now going into the lead. We've had the entire system virtually pushing the case for the EU. And there is no case for the EU when you break it down and you look at the consequences for people, freedom, small, medium-sized business. It's all about the giant corporations, the EU. When you look at the fine detail of our lives that is increasingly dictated by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, there is no case for the EU. So the only way they think they can do it is to frighten people into staying in out of concern about the consequences of coming out. And we've had this, as I'm just recording this now, we've had this story about this Conservative MP, Sarah Wollaston, who has quit the campaign to leave the EU and will vote for Remain instead, she told the BBC, who I'm sure will be delighted to hear it. Dr. Wollaston, chairman of the Health Select Committee, said Vote Leave's claim that Brexit would free up £350 million a week for the NHS simply isn't true. And so she's saying, as a result of not agreeing with what's being said there, that she's going to move to the other side and vote to stay in. The consensus now is there would be a huge economic shock if we voted to leave. In other words, she's bought the lie. Giving her the benefit of the doubt, she's bought the lie about the consequences of coming out compared with the catastrophic economic consequences of actually staying in. Greece, I rest my case. So her logic is that having looked at all the arguments over leaving the EU or staying in, she decided that leave was best. So then suddenly, because of one thing she didn't agree with, she's now moving over to the Stay In campaign, which has dramatically different consequences for Britain than if we come out. She's also saying that it's because of a lie about the NHS. So in response to that, she's going over to the Stay In campaign, which has been lying through its teeth and its dentures since day one to frighten people into staying in. It is an extraordinary example of the mental gymnastics that it takes to think that being controlled and dictated to by unelected bureaucrats with a hidden agenda is in any way even beginning to be sensible in terms of the way this country is governed and ruled. And like I say, it's amazing that anyone is voting to leave, given the incredible fear campaign to make them stay in. But of course, what has happened is people, never mind what the politicians say, people have had decades and decades of experience in their own lives and their own businesses and their own jobs of what it means to have the EU bureaucrats dictating everything. And so they are sensibly saying, we've got a chance to get out, let's get out. But while it's incredible how many people are wanting to leave in the circumstances of this campaign, if it wasn't for public ignorance, systematic public ignorance, of the real agenda and direction and desired outcome of this EU project, people weren't ignorant of what it's really about, there would be hardly anybody, apart from the elite and the system-serving, self-serving elite, who would be voting to stay in. I've been writing, researching and tracking the EU for decades, looking at its history, looking where it came from, looking where it wants to go. And from the start, provably, the idea was always to create a Europe-wide, centralized, bureaucratic, beyond democracy superstate, eventually breaking countries up into regions and transforming the face of Europe into a fascist-stroke communist dictatorship. We were sold at the start a free trade area because that's all that people would have accepted. If you'd have told the countries of Europe, after fighting the Nazis, to stop them creating a European superstate, that you want to do that yourself, well, you wouldn't have got far. So you don't tell them what you're really doing, you tell them what they'll find acceptable in enough numbers. So the whole idea was, we'll sell them a free trade area, and then step by step, what I call the totalitarian tiptoe, we'll move them towards what we planned all along. And so ever since the EU was created as the European Economic Community, the common market, step by step by step, more and more power has been taken to the centre and more power taken from national parliaments, ending, deleting, step by step, national sovereignty in Europe. Now, if people think it's bad now, this is where we are now. This is not where we're supposed to end. The idea is to take this incessant centralization of power, dictating all areas of European life, individually and collectively, deeper and deeper and deeper into this tyranny that's been planned from the start. And let's not kid ourselves that a lot of stuff has been held back purposely until this referendum is over, so as not to frighten the horses and have British people going, whoa, if that's coming, we're out. So I hear these people. Some know they're lying. Others are so ignorant they bought it. I hear politicians say, we ought to stay in and reform the EU from within, like it's ever happened before. The idea is not to allow the EU to be reformed, i.e. power taken from the centre in any way. It's to focus it and concentrate it even more at the centre. The idea is to pull more and more countries in with open borders across Europe, so that there is no control whatsoever by national governments of how many people from the EU pour into their country and overwhelm their public services, which is what's happening now. Plus all the other migration from outside the EU, the public services are collapsing. So that's what they plan. Not more of the same, but a dramatic increase on more of the same. And corporations, giant corporations, have had handed to them in the creation of the EU, not least because the same force controlling the corporations controls the EU and created it and advanced it to where it is now. The EU to corporations is it's almost like a gigantic orgasmic creation, because before corporations, to get what they want in each country by changing the laws and policies to benefit them, of course goes on all the time, they had to work in each individual country with each individual government to get those laws changed. Now, thanks to the EU, they have a one-stop shop. All they've got to do is get policy changed by the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, and instantly every country in Europe becomes subject to those law changes that suit the corporations. This is why you can see on the internet a documentary about how corporations control the EU and how around the European Commission in Brussels, where the bureaucrats are, is like this explosion of offices for lobbying organizations working for giant corporations. And like I say, this is not meant to stay where it is now. It's meant to go much, much more extreme to reach their goal that they set out from the start to achieve, of a totally centralized European dictatorship. And so we have this negotiation going on, negotiation it says here, between the EU, the corporations, and America, over this trade agreement called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And if they get what they want, it will mean that corporations can overturn or create or cause to happen massive fines for governments for changing the law or introducing legislation, maybe for the benefit of the environment, maybe for the benefit of people, maybe for the benefit of fairness, it does happen occasionally, of the people. But they would face corporate-type courts under this trade agreement if a corporation complained to the court that those new laws, which may be, like I say, of great benefit to people, of great benefit to the environment, could affect their future profits. In other words, corporations would openly control governments instead of behind the scenes doing it now, and the ability to control governments will be massively advanced. Now note, this TTIP trade agreement is between the EU and the United States. If we come out, bye-bye TTIP. And by the way, Sarah Wollaston, when you're changing sides because of something you don't agree with said about the NHS, the corporations will make a case supported by the EU, if this trade agreement goes through, that the National Health Service, the NHS, is affecting future profits of privatized corporations that deal in healthcare. It will be the end of the NHS And this government, Cameron's government, knows it. That's why they're running it down and trying to make it as inefficient and chaotic as possible to dilute public challenge and outrage when they start this privatization process. Oh, well, you know, it can't be any worse privatized than it was run by the government. That's the psychological manipulation that we're seeing all the time. So when you realize that there is a hidden hand, like a spider's web, and people like top politicians and financial organizations like central banks and the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Central Bank, the European Union, the banking system, they're all attached an answer to this web. It's when you've done the research that I have over the last more than a quarter of a century, it's a head shaker every day when you turn the news on. You see Obama come out, webman. You see Merkel come out, web woman. You see the IMF come out. You see the Bank of England come out. All these expressions of this web that answer to the web, and the European Union is massively part of the web, they all come out apparently spontaneously, apparently just saying what they think is best for people, telling us to stay in the EU, which is what the web wants. They're terrified of Britain coming out, because the idea is to pull more and more countries in and expand this superstate tyranny. Once one comes out, you know, it's not just vast numbers of British people who are sick of the EU. Vast numbers of people across the EU are sick of the EU. And the pressure will be to start breaking up this tyrannical edifice. They're terrified. That's why they're throwing everything. You know, I'm waiting for the claim that, you know, if we come out, Godzilla will attack London the next morning. It's unbelievable. But this is what's happening. And so you have the Stay In campaign led by David Cameron and George Osborne. And this elite, not least the House of Rothschild, they have little pockets put into their shirts about here on either side, and Cameron goes in one and Osborne goes in the other. So when they open their mouths, it is this elite, this web talking. But then you look at this, and I have to say, from my point of view, this grotesque sight of the Labour opposition party, along with the Greens and the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party and the unions, all lining up shoulder to shoulder with these pocket people, Cameron and Osborne, to press people to stay in the European Union. We have Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, who has been against the EU all his political career, now standing up and trying to make a case for it, including sits back in amazement, shakes head, takes breath, that they would reform it from within. These are organizations that's supposed to, in some way, stand for fairness and justice and looking after the people who are victims of the system rather than running it. And they are campaigning with these right-wing zealots to stay in a centralized, undemocratic, bureaucratic superstate that is by the day deleting more and more freedoms from the people they allegedly represent. And I've said in previous videocasts, the number of organisations that are campaigning to stay in who are on the EU payroll is fantastic. We have a situation where a number of people I've come across have said that they don't like the EU. They would really like to be outside, but they fear that if we come out, then the right wing, as it's perceived, the postage stamp, which they're all sitting on, that postage stamp political consensus currently run by the Conservative Party, would push on with austerity and injustice, unfettered, unstopped. A very important point to make here. The hidden hand that controls the Conservative Party in Britain and is pushing this austerity agenda is the same hidden hand that created, never mind, controls the EU. Thus, look at what the EU has done economically to Greece. It has destroyed it. It has got it into a situation where it's in enormous debt, a debt on money called credit that has never, does not, and will never exist. And as a result of that agreement, they have been asset stripped of state assets because the deal was, we'll give you this money that doesn't exist, that you can never pay back, and you will sell your assets basically for cents on the dollar to corporations, which is what's happened. And the idea of the EU control system is to asset strip the entire continent. So if anyone thinks that at least the EU will protect us from the extremes of the Conservative Party in Britain, well, forget it. That's not what the game is. We have Nicola Sturgeon, this left-wing kind of firebrand lady, who wants Scotland to come out of the United Kingdom and be an independent country within the European Union. An independent country within the European Union. If ever a contradiction in terms has ever been articulated, that is it. And she is vehemently campaigning to stay in the EU. Don't be controlled by London. Be controlled by Brussels. Oh my God. Talk about turkeys voting for Christmas. And then we have business, small business, medium-sized business, that is not a giant corporation. And they have been complaining, quite rightly, at the devastating effect on their businesses and ability to function of the deluge, the constant deluge of directives and new laws and regulations from the European Union. There's a reason for this. Why would an organization that cares about business and wants business to flourish crush them constantly with more and more red tape and bureaucracy, which has driven many of them out of business? Why would they? They wouldn't, because that's not the idea. The idea of making it harder and harder and harder to function as a small and medium-sized business, even some might be called, bigger business, is because the whole agenda is that eventually everything will be done by giant corporations, and there will be no small and medium size and less than giant corporation businesses. So once again, if you are involved in a business that is not a giant corporation and you're voting to stay in, right? Well, you too are turkeys voting for Christmas and Thanksgiving and any other appropriate analogy. Think what would happen if we came out and took control of our own country. We could take control of our borders so that we weren't seeing public services collapsing through sheer numbers. We could take control of our fishing grounds, which we gave away, Ted Heath gave away when he negotiated, the Prime Minister at the time, who negotiated us into this prison state. He gave away our fishing grounds in an island nation, and what has happened? It's destroyed the British fishing industry and many other things he gave away. And decades later, when he was asked on a BBC programme, did you know when you were negotiating entry into the common market, just a free trade area, nothing to worry about, that you were agreeing to political union at the time? He said, yes, of course. What he told the people at the time that we went in the early 1970s, was that he wasn't agreeing to political union, it was just a free trade area. And so when this MP, Sarah Wollaston, is talking about lies and then goes over to the Stay In campaign, the EU project has been based on lies, criminal, staggering levels of mendacity from start to now. And it's still going on in this campaign. And I emphasize again, this is not where it's meant to end. This is where we are now. They're now trying to stop coming out, but I've been writing about this since the 1990s, that this was the agenda of the EU. They're trying to stop coming out the fact that they are manipulating into place, as we speak, a European army. They want a European army and a European police force that overrides national sovereignty. And in all areas of our lives, they want to take complete control, including over the internet, what we can do on the internet, what we can't do on the internet. Already, the EU has impacted massively on internet freedom. And once again, that's nowhere near where they want to go. So ignorance is a devastating human trait, and it's systematic. The idea is to keep everyone ignorant of what's really happening, so what's really happening can go about its business unchallenged, unexposed, unseen. And I would say this, instead of listening to politicians and corporate CEOs and all these other system people before deciding what to do in this referendum on June 23rd, do your own research. People that have been with my work over the years do that. But those that haven't, do your own research into the history, the background of the European Union and what its real agenda is. It's in my books, it's in videos that I've done on the internet, and other documentaries are there from other people who've come up with the truth about the European Union. Get informed, and if you do, there's no way you will vote to stay in on June the 23rd. No way.